July 22nd, 1943. Sicily. George Patton stood in his command tent reading a field report, and the muscles in his jaw tightened in the way his staff had learned to read as a warning sign. The report detailed another incident involving Major General Terry Allen. Another violation of protocol, another chain of command bypassed, another set of orders interpreted so loosely they barely qualified as compliance. Patton's chief of staff stood to the side, waiting. Everyone in the tent was waiting. They had seen this before. They knew what came next. Except this time, nothing came next. Patton read the report a second time. Set it down. Then he said something that nobody in that tent forgot for the rest of their lives. I can't relieve him. He's the only division commander I have who genuinely frightens the Germans. That sentence contains the entire story of Terry Allen. Not because it reveals something surprising about Patton. Patton was many things, but he was never stupid about combat effectiveness. What it reveals is the particular, impossible position that Terry Allen occupied throughout the Second World War. Too effective to fire, too ungovernable to keep, the man the United States Army needed desperately and could never quite figure out what to do with. This is the story of how a man who failed out of West Point twice became the most feared American division commander of the war, and what the Army did to him because of it. Quick pause. This channel is built on the stories history forgot to tell, the real ones behind the monuments. If this is your kind of content, subscribe. We're aiming to hit 1,000 subscribers before the month ends, and every subscriber makes the next story happen. Where are you watching from? What hit you hardest? Leave it below. I read everything. Chapter 1, The Flawed Origin. Terry Allen arrived at West Point in 1907 and immediately failed to fit. West Point in the early 20th century was a finely calibrated machine for producing a specific kind of officer. Disciplined, formally educated, comfortable within hierarchical structures and the elaborate rituals of institutional military culture. The academy valued precision, uniformity, and the demonstrated willingness to subordinate individual judgment to the requirements of the system. Allen was none of those things. He had a learning difficulty that made the written academic curriculum a sustained ordeal. The classroom work that his classmates navigated with reasonable effort required from Allen an exhausting compensatory effort that left him behind on paper and obscured, entirely, the qualities that actually mattered. He was physically courageous, instinctively tactical, possessed of a quality of personal leadership that made men want to follow him into conditions they would refuse with anyone else. None of that appeared on written examinations. He failed out. He was readmitted. He failed out again. The institution had evaluated him and returned a clear verdict. Not officer material. The institution was wrong. Allen entered the Army as a commissioned officer through a different pathway in 1912. And what happened next is the part of the story that the official record tends to underemphasize. He thrived. Not despite his unconventionality, but because of it. On the Mexican border campaign, in the grinding trench warfare of the Western Front during the First World War, in the small unit engagements where the difference between an officer and a leader becomes viscerally apparent, Allen was remarkable. His men did not follow him because the Army required it. They followed him because they trusted him with their lives in a way that transcended the formal authority of rank. That quality cannot be taught at West Point. It cannot be assessed on a written examination. It is either present or it isn't. In Terry Allen, it was present to a degree that the system had almost discarded entirely. The back door he had entered through led, eventually, to the front of every fight the Army needed him for. Chapter 2, The Unorthodox Rise. By the time the Second World War began, Terry Allen had built a career on a pattern that his superiors found simultaneously impressive and infuriating. Every engagement ended in American victory. Every report of the victory was accompanied by a separate report of some procedural violation, some protocol ignored, some order modified beyond recognition by a commander who had decided in the moment that he understood the tactical situation better than the officer who had written the original instruction. He was frequently right. That was the problem. Being right while violating orders places the Army's disciplinary apparatus in an awkward position. The machinery is designed to punish deviation from protocol regardless of outcome, because the alternative, permitting violations when they produce results, corrodes the entire structural logic of military hierarchy. You cannot run an army on the principle that competent officers may disregard orders they disagree with. And yet, Every time Allen's file landed on a senior officer's desk with a recommendation for formal disciplinary action, something intervened. The battle record spoke too loudly. The casualties inflicted, the objectives taken, the ground held. The numbers made the procedural complaints look like what they were. The complaints of men who had been shown up by someone who refused to accept their limitations. In 1942, Allen was given command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the Army's most storied fighting formation. It was, in retrospect, the perfect match. The 1st Division had its own institutional pride, its own culture of aggressive independence, its own resistance to being managed by people who hadn't proven themselves in the field. Allen didn't manage them. He led them. General George Marshall, who understood fighting effectiveness with a clarity that cut through institutional politics, had watched Allen's record closely. When the complaints arrived at his level, Marshall made his position clear. Allen was going to North Africa with the 1st Division. What he did there would force a confrontation that reached all the way to Eisenhower's headquarters. But nobody in Washington knew that yet. Chapter 3: The Bureaucratic Clash. In North Africa, Terry Allen and the 1st Infantry Division did something that the American Army in 1942 desperately needed someone to do. They learned how to fight the Germans and survived the education. At Kasserine Pass, the broader American effort had collapsed under German pressure in ways that exposed critical weaknesses in training, leadership, and tactical doctrine. The 1st Division's performance was not flawless. No American units was in those early engagements. But Allen's men adapted with a speed and aggression that distinguished them from formations that were still absorbing the shock of meeting a seasoned enemy. This is where Patton enters the story properly. Patton arrived in North Africa to salvage the American campaign, and he called Allen to his headquarters with the specific intention of establishing, clearly and immediately, who was in command of what. Patton had a system. The system required certain standards of dress, bearing, and procedural compliance that he enforced with the same intensity he brought to tactical planning. Allen showed up in a uniform that had seen considerable recent use. He carried himself with the relaxed authority of a man who had been busy fighting and did not consider the condition of his jacket to be a relevant metric. Patton stared at him. Allen met the stare. "General," Allen said, in the tone of someone establishing a premise rather than asking a question. "Are we here to fight Germans or to pass inspection?" Patton had two choices: relieve Allen on the spot and send a clear message about standards, or recognize that the man standing in front of him was producing results that none of his more presentable officers were matching. Patton chose option 2. The alliance that formed between them was not warm. It was functional. The alliance of two men who disagreed about nearly everything except the fundamental question of what an infantry division was supposed to accomplish when it met the enemy. Omar Bradley was watching all of this. Bradley was methodical, careful, deeply invested in the institutional logic that Allen so casually disregarded. He observed the dynamic between Patton and Allen with the focused attention of a man keeping score. Bradley kept a notebook, and what he wrote in it would matter more than anyone realized. Chapter 4: The Crisis. Sicily, July 1943. The Allied invasion was moving, but not fast enough. Patton was driving his forces with characteristic urgency, the kind of pressure that transformed operational plans into fluid, opportunistic advances that the Germans struggled to respond to. Allen and the 1st Division were in the middle of it, and Allen, characteristically, was interpreting his orders with the creative latitude of a commander who believed that battlefield reality superseded written instruction. He was ordered to consolidate and hold. He attacked instead. The tactical logic was sound. There was a gap in the German line. The opportunity was real and time-sensitive, and waiting for formal authorization would have closed it permanently. Allen made the call that any aggressive commander with his read of the situation might have made. The problem was that he made it without telling Patton, or Bradley, or anyone in the chain of command who might have either endorsed or countermanded it. Patton found out when the engagement was already underway. The confrontation that followed was, by the accounts of those present, remarkable for what did not happen. Patton raged. Allen listened. And then Allen said something that even Patton had not expected. "If my judgment was wrong, relieve me now. But my men are not disengaging from a fight they are winning." The room was quiet. Patton had the authority. He had the justification. He had the precedent. Relieving a general who directly defied a command order during active operations was not only permitted, It was the institutional response the situation required. What he didn't have was a replacement who could hold the ground Allen's division was currently taking. He did not relieve Allen that day. But Bradley had been watching, and Bradley was done watching. The political architecture shifted in ways that Patton's protection could no longer address. Eisenhower's headquarters had heard enough about the 1st Division's discipline problems. The complaints had accumulated beyond the threshold that battlefield performance could offset. In August 1943, Terry Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. The official reason was discipline. The real reason was that the system had finally found a mechanism to remove a man it had never been able to fully contain. Here is what Bradley didn't write in his notebooks. He knew he was losing the best division commander in the theater. Chapter 5: The Rebirth. Allen was sent home. In the logic of the Army's personnel system, this was effectively exile. He had been removed from command of a storied division in the middle of an active campaign. The career trajectory was clear to everyone who understood how these things worked. You did not come back from that. You accepted a training assignment, performed it adequately, and concluded your service without the vindication you had been denied. Allen was given command of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. They were untested. They had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were draftees, ordinary American men from ordinary American cities who had been assembled into a military formation and were waiting to find out what that meant in practice. Allen decided to find out with them. Marshall had been watching, as he always watched. The relief had been unavoidable, but Marshall understood what the Army was getting when it got Terry Allen. He ensured that the assignment was real, not a parking position, but a genuine command with a genuine future, if Allen was willing to build it. Allen was more than willing. What he brought to the 104th was everything the system had spent a decade trying to regulate away from him. The absolute prioritization of combat effectiveness over procedural compliance, the conviction that soldiers fight for their unit and their commander before they fight for abstract national purpose, the relentless focus on the specific skills that kept men alive in contact with a determined enemy. He trained them in night operations, sustained, repeated, exhausting exercises in the dark, learning to move and communicate and coordinate without the visibility that most tactical doctrine assumed. He pushed them past the point where the training felt like preparation and into the territory where it became instinct. The men of the 104th did not know who Terry Allen was when he arrived. They knew by the time he was done with them. Every successful exercise was, in its quiet way, a response to the men who had removed him. Not a stated one, not an argument, simply the accumulating evidence of a commander building something that would speak for itself. The 104th Division was going to Europe, and what happened there would settle the question of who had been right about Terry Allen. Chapter 6: The Climax and Payoff. The 104th Infantry Division entered combat in October 1944 on the Western Front, and what they did in the following months rewrote the assessment that Bradley's notebook had constructed. In the Rhineland campaign, they operated with the sustained aggression and tactical precision of a formation that had been built from the ground up by a commander who understood combat as a problem of will and training rather than organizational structure. They moved at night when other units stopped. They attacked objectives that the conventional operational logic suggested required more preparation, more coordination, more time. In early 1945, the 104th executed a crossing of the Roer River under conditions that had stalled heavier, more celebrated formations. The assault went in darkness, with the precision of men who had rehearsed exactly this kind of operation until it required no discussion and generated no hesitation. Patton's forces had struggled with the same obstacles. Think about what that means. The general who had been removed for ungovernable behavior, given an untested division as what was functionally a consolation assignment, had trained those men to accomplish what the Army's most aggressive commander could not. The German commanders who faced the 104th in those final months noted, in the cold clinical language of after-action analysis, that the American unit moving against them at night was different from the others. More adaptable, more difficult to fix in place or predict. They were describing what Terry Allen had built from draftees in the months after his exile. Patton died in December 1945 without ever publicly addressing what Allen had accomplished with the 104th. Bradley outlived both of them and wrote extensively about the war. The pages about Allen are notable for their brevity. Terry Allen retired in 1946. He was never given another major command. The institution he had embarrassed repeatedly had long memories and longer administrative patience. But the 104th Division's veterans knew what they had done, and they knew who had built them into the unit that did it. The system had spent 30 years trying to correct Terry Allen. In the end, Terry Allen was the correction. If this story stayed with you, you belong here. Subscribe and come back for the next one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and which part of this hit you hardest. I read every single one.